I started gathering data about the performance of the i5-3470, hoping that this somewhat newer CPU might still be good enough for gaming, and to answer a question that I had. With 3rd gen and 2nd gen having essentially the same cores, was the i5-2400 held back by its PCIe Gen 2 only support, and maybe the low RAM speed of 1333 MHz? You see, there is little difference in terms of frequencies between the two non-hyper-threaded quad cores, with the 3470 running 100 MHz higher on the base clock and 200 MHz for the boost. And with the 3470 rated 18 watts lower than the 2400, one could then hope for lower temperatures and for the Ivy Bridge CPU to boost for longer. But despite using the same cooler that kept the temperature for the more power-hungry Centi-Bridge CPU in the low 70s, the i5-3470 ended up in the high 70s or even low 80 degrees Celsius. Yes, it's that infamous thermal paste that Intel decided to use between the chip and the IHS for its 3rd gen processor instead of the solder used for Sandy-Bridge. I used the same test system as before, based on the GA-B75D3V motherboard from Gigabyte, the 16GB of DDR3 that do get used at 1600 MHz this time around, and the GTX 970. And just as a reminder before going into the gaming results, we will use the GigASUS rendering test to see how much the increased memory frequency helps the CPU in terms of IPC. Now, while the bar for multiplayer games is 60 FPS for the 1% lows, I will give Marvel Rivals a passing grade, despite the only 53 FPS for that metric. The 3470 also managed an average of 98 FPS, which is more than fine. The test was performed at low settings, 720 resolution and 30% resolution scale. Cyberpunk 2077 is also playable on the 3470, with an average FPS of 66 and the 1% loss of 42. I used the canned benchmark at 720 resolution and low settings. I basically started with the low preset, then made sure that all options that could still be reduced do get set to their minimum. I was completely caught by surprise by how well Fortnite ran at 720 resolution, performance mode and the draw distance set to far. You see, the previously reviewed i5 had an atrocious 1% lows, but the 3470 managed 73 FPS for the 1% lows and an average above 130. You do get the occasional stutter, as captured by the 0.1% lows, but overall, the game felt good. Rainbow Six Siege also runs fine. At 720 resolution, low settings and 50% render scale, the test system is firmly CPU bound, so one has to thank the i5-3470 for both the over 150 FPS average and the 107 FPS 1% lows. The benchmark did stutter a bit at the very beginning, as shown by the 0.1% lows, but after those initial few seconds, it went smooth. And I have more good news, with Apex Legends also being playable, in my opinion. To get the run to be CPU bound, I tested at 720 resolution and lower settings. The i5-3470 averaged 167 FPS and the 1% loss managed 67. To get an idea as to why I'm happy with the 3470, the 2400 failed to get that 1% loss above 40. Despite the CPU usage percentage in the low 90s, that then translated into temperatures in the high 70s, Overwatch 2 managed a decent gaming experience, with the average FPS reaching above 400 and the 1% lows making it to almost half than that. The 0.1 lows is still fine at almost half the value for the 1% lows. Despite the encouraging results from the previously tested games, I was a bit nervous when loading CS2 and playing a bot match in DOTA 2. But at 720 resolution and low settings, with FSR disabled, the 3470 managed an average FPS close to 120. And fortunately, the 1% lows managed to go above 60 FPS, making the practice match a good experience. By now we all know that DOTA 2 is CPU bound at low settings even at 1080 resolution. The i5-3470 managed to render the match replay in good conditions, with the average FPS making it to 70 and the 1% lows in the mid-40s. This is fine for this game. Robocop is playable. I ran my test at 720 resolution and 50% render scale. The Ivy Bridge CPU managed 64 FPS for the average and 30 for the 1% lows. The game will dip occasionally lower than that, as pointed out by the 0.1% lows. This will translate in the occasional slowdowns rather than the annoying stutters, and these won't detract from the game experience too much. The final still hates anything that does not have the AVX2 instruction set extensions. And while the i5-3470 does run better than the i5-2400, it still shares the same lack of AVX2 capabilities. Capturing FPS data in the quick cache tutorial at 720 resolution and low settings has the CPU averaging at 63 FPS. Both 1% and 0.1% loss, however, were plain bad at 12 and 2 FPS respectively. This is why I won't play a single match online with any of these two CPUs running in my PC. The village scene from Shadow of the Tomb Raider's benchmark is notoriously CPU dependent, but to make sure the GPU performance was out of the picture, I went for the 800 by 600 resolution and the lowest settings. The benchmark turned an average of 67 FPS and the 1% lows at 48. Even the 0.1% lows were fine at 33, but I did notice some textures popping in, so take these numbers with a grain of salt. Borderlands 3 also runs fine on the i5-3470. To get the benchmark to run in a CPU-bound scenario, I dropped the resolution to 720 and the settings to their lowest. I got in return 86 FPS for the average and 50 for the 1% lows. The 0.1% lows number will make itself felt as a rare stutter, but nothing to detract from playing the game. Control is the last game tested, but this time around I went for 720 resolution and low settings, and the i5-3470 averaged almost 120 FPS. The 1% lows also played at a comfortable value of almost 50 FPS. And as you probably expected, you will get an occasional stutter as pointed out by the 0.1% lows, but nothing to get you worried about. I used the last stage in the rendering of the GigASUS R9-270 video as my productivity test. We compute the number of clock cycles needed to finish this fixed amount of work, and that provides a hint of the IPC of this processor. The i5-3470 needed around 35 minutes to complete the rendering, and at an average frequency of 3.3 GHz, this ran translated into just shy of 28,000 trillion cycles. For comparison, this is significantly better than the i5-2400, managing to outpace even the i7-2600 when hyperthreading is turned off. I paid around $7 for my i5-3470. If you can find a cheap motherboard that will support it, asterisk, it can be a surprisingly capable CPU for everyday computing and occasional gaming. Now about that asterisk. Not all LGA 1155 boards were born the same. Major OEMs like Dell, HP or Lenovo will build their own motherboards then limit support for 3rd gen Intel Core processors by using a small SPI chip, to then have an excuse for not providing a BIOS update. The intent there was to then get the enterprise customers to pay for entire PCs when 3rd gen launched. Unfortunately, this may turn choosing a board for a 3rd gen Intel based PC into a bit of an adventure. Couple that with the somewhat worse temperatures, despite the lower TDP, and this might explain why Sandy Bridge CPUs seem to be more frequently available than 3rd gen. According to Intel's own TikTok roadmap, the next generation of core CPUs, Haswell, was responsible for bringing in a new architecture. As for how much of that means in terms of gaming performance, we'll see that in a follow-up video. And we're done with this one. Thanks for watching, I hope you liked it.